We are here today with Dr. Scott, who is an environmental researcher at the Central Queensland University. He has done some environmental research on Curtis Island, and he has allowed me to come here to his lab today and ask him some questions about his findings on Curtis Island. Hello, Dr. Scott.
Hello.
My first question to you is, how would you describe the environment on Curtis Island?
The environment on Curtis Island is quite a diverse one. It's got a range of plant communities, from woodlands to heathlands, even to small forests. And so probably 75% or so of the island is actually preserved under national park because of the diverse range of vegetation that is contained within it. It's some of the last remaining patches of this type of vegetation in its natural state for the region. So Curtis Island is unique in that it does contain a lot of that vegetation that was once everywhere across the central Queensland region, and so it's quite a nice representation of that. It also contains some rare and threatened animals as well. So there's one animal in particular is called the yellow chat, which is a small yellow bird, and its habitat has been reduced elsewhere, and so one of the last remaining kind of strongholds for it is on Curtis Island. And it kind of lives in amongst the salt pans and the low heathland vegetation that we don't have a lot of because of development elsewhere outside the region. So some unique plants, some unique animals.
Very interesting. My next question is, could you please give us a brief idea of what research or surveys you have done on Curtis Island?
Sure. So I do research all around the region, but specifically for Curtis Island, my research has really been around marine debris or litter. So litter that ends up on our streets and then wash into the waterways. I've surveyed around the shorelines of Curtis Island and basically found that there's quite significant loads ending up on these shorelines and potentially impacting on the bird life, turtles which come up to nest on the shores around there as well, and found that the sources of these are partially fishing related, partially from just stormwater runoff, so things that accidentally drop on the ground or are deliberately thrown on the ground, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But another significant portion of that rubbish is from industry. So around Gladstone, there's lots of industry, and particularly now on Curtis Island, we have industry being developed. So there's definitely concerns for a growing source of impact from industry and shipping that feeds that industry in the region. And definitely on Curtis Island, we're finding a lot of that rubbish is where it is ending up.
Yeah, interesting. And what would you say, there is a major threat to the environment on Curtis Island? And if so, where or who would these threats be coming from?
There's probably a multitude of potential threats. I mentioned turtles before, and turtles are obviously have a unique behaviour where they come up onto the beaches and lay the eggs in a burrow in the sand, and then the hatchlings come out of there and go back to the sea. One thing that has been found is that they are affected by light, so it's light pollution, if you like. So street lights or industry lights in particular, which are operating for 24 hours a day, affect where the turtles lay the eggs, and it also affects the hatchlings when they pop out of the nest, which direction they go. They can be confused, and so instead of heading back to the sea, they might be drawn inland to where the lights are of, say, the industry. And in Curtis Island's case, the industry is actually on the landward side of where the turtles, or on the other side of where the beaches are. And so there's concerns that light pollution from the industries that have been developed on Curtis Island could affect turtle hatchlings. So because they're so close, and the glow of the industry can affect, which direction they move in.
Yeah.
So that's one obvious, threat or impact that we see from industry on Curtis Island. There's pollution, of course, as I mentioned, with the litter. So there's concerns over increased loads washing in to the sea and onto the beaches from that as well. So they're probably the two most that are in the forefront of my mind.
Yeah, interesting. And Dr. Scott, who looks after the environment on Curtis Island? Is it being taken care of by anyone or any particular organisation?
Sure, there's a number of groups that are involved in managing the island. It's, as I said before, a large proportion of it is in national park, and so the Queensland Parks and Wildlife manage that part of it. Towards the southern end of the island, there's a small community of South End, and that is managed by Gladstone Regional Council. And then over to the other side of the southern end is where the industry, the LNG plants are being developed, and they have a right to manage their property under strict environmental guidelines. So there's the state government, there's an environment department under the state government that manages or oversees that these industries are actually performing their environmental duties on their land. So there's a range of people involved in managing it. Makes it complex, but it's they each have a role to play, and all I think perform those tasks to the best of their abilities.
Good to know. And from your experience, are you aware of any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander communities that may have altered the environment on the island through their methods of land and resource management?
Yeah, well, there's definitely local Aboriginal communities around the Gladstone region and central Queensland, and so there's evidence of them using and being seen on, not seen. they have been seen, I'm sure. There's evidence of them.
We know what you mean.
Evidence of them on the island from records and from things like middens and various other things that represent historical use of the island. Probably the major impact that we could say has come from Aboriginal use of the island has been from a process called fire stick farming. And fire stick farming is where the Aboriginal communities used to deliberately light fires to change the vegetation structure. And so that was done to promote certain plants over others, and to also allow for easier capture of prey items like kangaroos and things like that. So what we see of the vegetation today, even though it's all grown back, because a lot of those plants are adapted for fire conditions and can survive in them. What those plants that we see today are pretty much, as a result, we can hypothesise, related to activities such as that fire stick farming. And so that not only occurred on Curtis Island, but across Australia. So that's probably the major impact that we could say, that the change in the vegetation structure was quite likely from Aboriginal use and occupation on the island.
Very interesting. And lastly, can you tell us what major changes have occurred in the environment due to industry?
So, I mean, the obvious major changes where the LNG plants have been built at the southern end of the island. Obviously, whole swathes of land have been cut away.
Yeah.
They've removed huge parcels of land, so the vegetation has not only been removed, but the whole hillsides have been taken out as
Wow.
well. And it's quite stark in some places that you've got half a hill.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's an immediate major impact,
Yes.
of course. That obviously was designated by both state and federal governments to allow that to occur, being a site of least impact to the island that wasn't in the national park.
Yes.
The national parks are more to the north, but to the south, you've lost a huge parcel of land that was originally under natural vegetation, and obviously the fauna that were in those areas cannot go there anymore.
Yeah,
So that's an immediate thing. The other impacts, as I've hinted on, pollution-related impacts. So once the industries are up and running and ships are coming into the harbour, then we've got potential for more runoff, more waste being produced and littering, if you like, occurring as a secondary impact from those industries being in place. The LNG plants don't produce a lot of other impacts apart from light.
Yeah.
And so directly on the island, so the light impact that I mentioned before with the turtles is definitely another one of concern. So light, litter, and then just the physical structure are probably the three major impacts.
Yes, very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scott, and thanks for having me here today.
No worries, it's quite all right.